The point I like to make at the very start is that the Gospels work differently. There are four Gospels. I think we're better off having four Gospels than one. Sometimes that question gets asked. Why four Gospels instead of one just running account? And what you get through the multiple Gospels are multiple angles on Jesus, with different people taking different perspectives about him and bringing that through. So it's like when you listen to music, do you want to listen through one channel, or would you rather have quadraphonic sound? Or if you're thinking about the way sporting events work, is it worth it to have one camera angle on the game, or is it worth it to have multiple camera angles on the game, especially when you're doing a video review of a controversial aspect of the game and you're trying to decide a particular question? Because certain camera angles will answer the question you have, while other camera angles will not. And so the Gospels work in that way to surround the story of Jesus and give us kind of a surround sound picture of Jesus. The Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, and by the Synoptic Gospels, I mean Matthew, Mark, and Luke, tell the story of Jesus from the earth up. What I mean by that is you start with categories that are mostly you're used to in thinking about a human being, and then you work your way up to see who Jesus is and to see the divinity of Jesus, if you will. John tells it from heaven down. From the very first verse, you know what John's take is on Jesus, because he opens up with, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Right there in the first verse, he's telling you that Jesus is, and then he uses a title all through his gospel, the sent one from heaven. So those two perspectives produce some of the differences that we see between the gospels. In fact, John's gospel has about 88% of unique material versus the other three synoptics. So he's doing a lot of stuff that's unique, and his perspective and emphasis is unique from the very beginning. But the three synoptic gospels are important because they take us through the sequence of how someone comes to understand who Jesus is. And that's because the category that people have about who Jesus is not something that comes normally. I tell people this way. In the United States, about 30% of the population are religiously called nuns. That's None. And that means they have no religious affiliation. They're agnostic or atheists. They don't think theologically at all. And so to go out and tell them that Jesus is the Son of God, with all that that means, is to have a category they don't even understand. And the reason I say that is because if you think about how many human beings that have walked the earth out of the history of all the human beings that have walked the earth, that could credibly attempt to claim they are the creator God incarnate, there's only been one. That's Jesus, a completely unique category. And so just understanding who Jesus is for a lot of people means that categories have to be created that people don't have. I tell people, when you share evangelism today in a lot of the world, you have to create categories they don't have. How do you do that? Well, you explain who Jesus is on the one hand, and you relationally connect to the person in such a way that they're willing to contemplate the category that you're thinking they're supposed to have. So this is an important discussion to make sense out of Jesus when he operates out of categories that people are not normally thinking about. Now, another point that I'm going to be making all through the webinar is that Jesus spends as much time showing who he is as much as saying who he is. Oftentimes when people approach the gospel, they'll say, well, what does Jesus have to say about himself? And the fact is that in the Gospels themselves, Jesus doesn't say very much directly about who he is. He doesn't use a lot of titles around himself as he talks about himself, but he does show who he is on a regular basis. And if you understand the background that fills in that picture, and I'm going to call that background cultural scripts, I'll be talking about that later. We're going to give background as to how we got the gospel materials, why we can trust them, then connect the storyline of the gospel so we can see how they show who Jesus is, basically working from the earth up. Because everyone who comes to Jesus has to come to Jesus from the earth up. No one comes to Jesus by being born and immediately go, oh, Jesus, the second person of the ontological Trinity. No one inherently understands who Jesus is. Someone has to explain who Jesus is to them. And the Gospels show us how to do this. One of the reasons the Synoptic Gospels are so important in comparison to John, and this is the reverse of the way the church normally works, is that John does all our hard work for us and assumes Jesus' position from heaven down. But the Synoptic Gospels actually show how someone can come to understand who Jesus is divine when they don't start out thinking about the possibility that Jesus might be divine. They actually take us from the earth up to understand who Jesus is. And the church needs to learn how to tell the story that way and not just from the perspective of the Gospel of John. So all that's kind of background for what we're going to be doing. So the first thing I want to do, I want to talk about a period that you don't even think about normally. And that is the period between the event and the writing of a gospel. That period is important because it runs to be between 30 and 60 years, depending on which gospel you're talking about. Most conservative scholars will date Matthew, Mark, and Luke somewhere in the 60s, and they'll date the Gospel of John in the 90s. But Jesus lived in the early 30s. So we're talking about a 30-year gap for the Synoptic Gospels and a 60-year gap in the case of the Gospel of John between the event and the recording of a gospel. Now, why is that? Well, part of the reason is that we lived in the first century in an oral world. It was not a written world. It was not a digital world. It was an oral world. Most things that happened got passed on orally. There wasn't a lot of writing. In fact, there wasn't a lot of literacy. Estimates are that only about 10% of the population was what we would consider to be significantly literate. And so stories were passed on orally, and there also was the belief in this period that hearing from someone directly who experienced the event, what's called the living word or the spoken word, was more valuable than anything that was written down. So you don't go to write a gospel until you begin to lose your eyewitnesses. So I want to think about the gap between the event and the writing down, because critics will say, all kinds of things happened in that gap. All kinds of things were done. So we're going to think about orality initially. We're going to think about memory, and we're going to think about eyewitnesses in relationship to the word. So let me start off by saying it this way. In the beginning, in an oral world, which is not a print world or a digital world, in the beginning, there were no books, or virtually no books. In the beginning, there was memory and the passing on by word of mouth. If I wanted to share what Jesus did and said for many periods, this was done orally. This was done in the worship services. This was done between disciples and whoever they were interacting with. And the claim by some critics is that the tradition was loose, like the memory game, what's sometimes called the memory game, sometimes it's called the telephone game. In the area of Asia and Australia, New Zealand, it's called Chinese whispers. And the way that game works is you tell a story at the beginning, it's a fairly long story, and then each person has to retell the story to the person next to them. And the fun of the game is, what's the story like at the end of the sequence versus the beginning of the sequence? And Bart Ehrman, who teaches New Testament at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, argues that the tradition is loose like the memory game, so there's no guarantee that what we have in the Gospels is at all like what really happened, because of the way the tradition kind of loosely filtered its way over time between the event and the writing down of a gospel. The second claim that comes from critics is, even if there were eyewitnesses, memory is not really trustworthy. Memory leaks, if you will. You don't retain things accurately over time. John Dominic Crossan, who co-chaired the Jesus Seminar back in the 1990s, argued, I think there were eyewitnesses behind the tradition, but that doesn't mean the eyewitnesses, when they tell the story years later, have remembered it the way it actually happened. So you've got this challenge about what happens in this gap. So I call this talk Minding the Gap Between the Event and the Recording of the Gospels. In fact, you don't start to get recording of the Gospels until you lose your eyewitnesses. When you begin to lose your oral voice, then you want to record the Gospel so that you have the memory of that oral voice recorded. And that's why we have a 30 to 60 year gap between the production of the Gospels. So let's think about an oral world for a second. And if we think about the oral world, I need to reference a person who worked among Bedouin tribes in the Middle East as part of his work. He also taught New Testament in the Middle East. He's a man named Kenneth Bailey. And he wrote a little short article, it's only about 7 pages long, in which he said there are 3 types of orality in the world. One is what he called informal and uncontrolled, which means that the stories circulate with no oversight and they can go anywhere and anyone can tell the story. So it's informal, there's no oversight of it. It's uncontrolled, anyone can tell the story. The telephone game picture of Bart Ehrman is reflective of this approach, the informal and uncontrolled approach. It reflects the way some criticism of the 1920s that fed into form criticism thought about the way traditions develop over time. And Ehrman is reflecting that point of view. This was studied as a way of dealing with orality and oral culture by starting off studying folklore out of Iceland. I sometimes joke, well, at least they had the first letter of the region right, the letter I. But Iceland's not Ireland, and medieval folklore is not the time frame of when the Gospels were permitted or were produced. Now, the second way that Bailey talks about, and what some people did to push back on this original model that said, well, medieval folklore out of Iceland and the loose circulation of the tradition is what happened in the church, was to appeal to the rabbis of Israel of the 2nd century and beyond, which was very precise, and only certain ones get to tell the story. And Bailey labeled this formal and controlled. It was formal, there was a structure to it, and it was controlled. Only some people could tell the story. It also was very precise, almost word for word. And so some people working in New Testament, pushing back on the original model, said the rabbinic model is a better model. And it is, it's a better model, but it doesn't fit the phenomena that we see in the Gospels, which is that we get variation and gist. We have the same stories told, but they aren't told exactly the same way each time they're told. So we've got to be able to account for the variation. So formal and controlled, thinking about it so tightly controlled that there's not any variation, doesn't work. So Bailey said, what I see among the Bedouin tribes that I work with is the third model, the informal and controlled. Informal means that anyone can tell the story, but controlled means there is a structure of oversight and there are people who oversee the way the story is told. So if the story deviates too much, the elders or the people who are in control of the story and are viewed as being the elders of the community will correct the storytelling. So anyone can tell the story. It comes with variation and gist, but there is oversight of the core story. And Bailey says, what I see among the Bedouin tribes that I minister to in the Middle East, if things haven't changed from the way this has been done, and this has been done this way for a long time, what I get is an informal and controlled way of handling orality. There's a way to do orality that allows it on the one hand to be overseen, but also allows the story to be told with some variation. And so orality doesn't float anywhere and everywhere. It's controlled. And particularly once that controlled material gets put into a gospel, formalized and fossilized, if you will, then it becomes very controlled because the churches were responsible for the initial circulation of the Gospels and had an eye on what that content was because now the content had been written down. So this is Bailey arguing that ancient orality can be trustworthy, it can be passed on, it is passed on with some level of care, but it is also passed on with variation in gist and how the story is told. This leads to the discussion of memory. There's also discussion of memory that comes with regard to, I may have eyewitnesses, but if eyewitnesses are trying to remember something that's years old, how can we be sure that what they remember is actually the case? And the name I have here is Robert McIver. Robert McIver did a study. In fact, he did it at Tübingen. He was my neighbor at Tübingen during one of my sabbaticals. He did a book on memory and the Gospels and examined the study of memory studies that psychologists have done over time, all the ways in which memory has been studied over time, how memory leaks, how does it fossilize, those kinds of things, and wrote a book on it. And he was responding in part to discussions that relate to the Gospels, like John Dominic Crossan, who said, well, I believe there are eyewitnesses and I believe there's memory, but memory leaks. Memory doesn't always remember everything completely accurately, especially over time. And I got to hear John Dominic Crossan actually give one of these presentations at Southern Methodist University, that's SMU on the slide, in which he discussed memory. And he said, I think there are eyewitnesses. I think they relied on their memory, but their memory isn't trustworthy. And then he produced what was one of the more famous memory studies ever done. And he was doing it right after this experiment had been done. And it comes from Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, where during what was called the Challenger disaster, this was a space shuttle that exploded on launch, didn't make it into space. And what made it traumatic, not only was it the loss of the space shuttle and the loss of the astronauts, but on this particular mission, there had been a national competition for a science teacher to go into space with the astronauts and teach a set of science classes from space. That was the plan. And her life was lost in the explosion, along with that of the astronauts. So it was a particularly traumatic event. Well, what they did at Emory University is they called in a bunch of freshmen and they asked them, where were you when you heard about the Challenger disaster? The space shuttle was called the Challenger. And how did you hear about it? And they recorded it. 3 years later, on the premise that they were seniors now and would soon be leaving the school, they called them back in and asked the same two questions. And then they compared the answers after a 3-year difference. And they found out that in about 50% of the cases, the answers differed. So they called those students back who had the differing answers and said to them, here are the two sets of answers that you gave us, but they didn't label which one came when. And they asked the students, which set of answers is actually what took place? What do you actually remember as having really taken place? And in about a significant number of those examples, they chose the more recent memory rather than their original memory. And so the study concluded that sometimes memory changes the perception of what originally happened. And that often happens in the case. So you can't trust what's been said later on the basis of what's been said earlier. Now, I was asked at this presentation to respond in a rejoinder to what it is Crossan raised here. And I got up in my response and I said, well, it's one thing to ask freshmen at Emory University who have no connection to the space program. They aren't a part of NASA. NASA stands for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. They run the space program in the United States. It'd be one thing to ask Emory freshmen. It's another thing to if we asked people who worked at NASA who were responsible for the Challenger, who would have felt the pain of the disaster as being part of their team. And I said, I don't know this, but I suspect that if we ask people at NASA, the results of the memory of what took place would be better than if we just ask random students who don't have anything deeply connected or anything that they're required through their vocation to remember as a result of what took place. Now, they've since done studies in which that is part of the sample. You're comparing people who have something at stake in what's going on from people who are not connected to it. And memory, although it's not perfect, is much, much better in those situations. So the point I was making was one that has since been substantiated by studies. MacIver, in doing his work, said that after 5 years, the gist of what is said is retained. And after 5 years, the story takes on a form that doesn't change very much after 5 years. Once you remember it after a 5-year period, that's the way you're going to remember it, is the point that he's making. Now, having said all that, there's a difference between the way the Gospels work and stories worked in the oral period and these experiments, because these experiments say you have an event and you're asking someone to recall it down the road. but there's no guarantee that what you're asking them to recall down the road is something that they were required to remember on a regular basis or think about on a regular basis between the two remembrances. When we think about the Gospels, that's not the way the gospel tradition worked, because the gospel tradition involves stories about Jesus that were told to be retained, and they were told again and again and again and again. They appeared repeatedly in worship services as people shared what it is Jesus did and taught. There also is another feature that makes it different, and that is we're not dealing with the memory of an individual, we're dealing with corporate memory. We have the 12 apostles who remember what Jesus did. They can pool their memory about what took place. So there's some features of orality, even when the gospel is being passed on orally and retained within the context of worship, that is different than just simply recording a random event by an individual who remembers it years later without it having been retold, or without thinking about the way other people have retained the event in question. Now, I want to talk about variation in gist in thinking about this, because we have numerous places in the Gospels where we have the same story but different details. And we get those details of variation in gist. I tell people, if the disciples spent 3 years with Jesus and walked and talked with him day after day, after a 3-year period, they probably would have a pretty good memory of the basic things that Jesus taught, including how he thought about himself. It's just natural to think about what takes place if you spend that much immersed time with someone and that much immersed time in a topic. So we get variation in gist, but we also have to remember that difference doesn't always equal contradiction because of the way information can be told and retold. And so to think about this, I've just noted a handful of examples. I could multiply this endlessly in the Gospels and in Acts. And the examples that I think of are the way in which certain events get retold. For example, you have the appearing of Jesus to Paul on the Damascus Road told 3 times in Acts by the same author, Acts 9, Acts 22, and Acts 26. If you actually compare these tellings to one another, there are certain details that are the same. And the gist of the story is certainly the same. Paul's conversion came as a result of Jesus appearing to him. But there also are variations in detail. In Acts 9, when it's first told, Ananias becomes a figure who tells Paul his calling and what it is God is asking of him to take the gospel to the Gentiles. By the time we retell the story in Acts 26, Ananias doesn't appear at all. He isn't even a part of the story. This shows us how the same author can take the same event, present its core in the same way, and yet tell it with variation. And I would argue this is the way the tradition worked in the first century. We're seeing the dynamics of how that works. Sometimes it's told with a great deal of detail. Sometimes it's summarized. But it's the same story in the same event. Another example of the same thing is the parable of the soils. If you take the parable of the soils and you just look at the seed that was sown on the road, you get this description in the various Gospels. Matthew says that the seed was picked up by the evil one. Mark says the seed was picked up by Satan. Luke says the seed was picked up by the devil. Now, I like this example because it's interesting. I get 3 different answers for who's responsible for picking up the first seed in that parable, but I get one referent. They're all referring to the same thing. They're just describing it in different ways. The evil one, Satan, or the devil, all ultimately the same figure. I've got variation in gist right here. And even though I've got difference, I don't have contradiction because the evil one, Satan, and the devil are the same person. So that shows you this variation in gist idea that I'm trying to raise that's a part of the gospel tradition as events get retold. We also have an example in the healing of the centurion's slave, the event that comes right after the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain in Matthew and Luke, respectively. In Matthew, you have a face-to-face meeting between between Jesus and the centurion as he asked for the healing of his slave. However, in Luke, you have a meeting that takes place through two sets of emissaries, Jewish emissaries. You get a difference. Now, what's going on here? There are a couple of things going on. In Matthew, a longer version has been reduced down in size and simplified in the story. The second thing that's going on here is the principle of the shaliach, or the sent one, which is the idea in the ancient world that if I commission someone to speak in my name, it's as good as my being present and speaking to them. I tell people we actually do this all the time ourselves. We just don't think about it. When a press conference is held at the White House and the press secretary speaks and briefs the press about what's going on at the White House, we don't care about that meeting because of who the press secretary is. We care about that meeting because the press secretary represents the president and is seen as speaking for the president. So we actually do this kind of thing ourselves. It's called the shaliach principle, the sent one. And if I send someone in my name, the one who hears you hears me. In fact, Jesus said that about his apostles. The one who hears your voice hears my voice. So I can summarize as if the centurion's present, but I can also highlight by doing that the way in which Jews and Gentiles can get along, which is something Luke cares about that Matthew doesn't care about quite so much. And so that allows Luke to introduce a theme that Matthew simply bypassed because he was more interested in just the healing and in summarizing the healing and how it took place, and summarizing the request of the centurion as being from the centurion, than to giving you all the details about how that took place. Another example of the same thing, another couple of examples. You have Jairus' daughter. In Matthew's telling, the daughter is dead at the start, whereas in Mark and Luke, which are longer versions again, 14 verses 8, we get the story of how the information that Jairus' daughter had died came to Jesus while he was dealing with the woman who had the flow of blood. This is just a different way of summarizing and compacting, which is what Matthew is doing, versus giving you more detail, which is what Luke is doing. You also have the example of the fig tree, the withering of the fig tree in Matthew and Mark. In Matthew, this withering is said to happen at once, whereas in Mark, we're told Jesus cursed the fig tree, and when they came back the next day, the fig tree was withered. Now, the question is, what constitutes an at-once withering? How long does it have to take for something to be withered at once? Are we talking immediately, right there as the words are spoken, or is the next day withering qualified? And are we dealing again with summary? So I can get variation, I can get difference, but that difference doesn't automatically lead to contradiction. Those are some New Testament examples. Okay, let me stop there. I've dealt with orality, I've dealt with memory, and I've dealt with the variation and gist of orality and the nature of differences, not necessarily, that difference doesn't necessarily equal contradiction.